In the spring of 1943, the war in North Africa was drawing to a close, and the Allied High Command faced a problem that was as much psychological as it was military. The German and Italian forces, battered and pressed from multiple directions, were finally collapsing across Tunisia. Within weeks, over 250,000 Axis troops would surrender, the largest capitulation since Stalingrad. But victory in North Africa was not, by itself, enough. The Allies needed to cross the Mediterranean. They needed to strike into what Winston Churchill famously called the soft underbelly of Europe, to open a front that would relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, draw German divisions away from France, and begin the long, grinding work of pushing the Axis out of continental Europe entirely. The question was not whether to invade. The question was where. The obvious answer was Sicily. Sitting at the toe of the Italian boot, the island was geographically unmistakable, the natural stepping stone from North Africa into southern Europe. It was close enough for Allied air cover, large enough to sustain a major amphibious operation, and strategically positioned to threaten the entire Italian peninsula, which was precisely the problem. If the answer was obvious to Allied planners, it was equally obvious to the Germans. Adolf Hitler and his staff had already concluded that Sicily was the most likely target. German and Italian divisions were being reinforced there. Coastal defenses were being hardened. The Axis knew an invasion was coming, and they were fairly confident they knew where it would land. To assault Sicily under those conditions would be to hand the enemy the advantage of preparation. The Allies needed something more than military force. They needed to make the enemy look the wrong way. What emerged from the offices of British intelligence was one of the most audacious, morally strange, and operationally brilliant deceptions of the entire war. It began, as so many extraordinary things do, with an absurd idea taken seriously. A British intelligence officer had once circulated a memo, inspired of all things by a pre-war detective story, suggesting that a corpse dressed in military uniform and carrying false documents might be floated ashore in enemy territory, where it would be discovered and its papers passed up the chain of command as genuine intelligence. The idea had been filed away. In 1943, it was retrieved. The operation that followed would be called Operation Mincemeat. Its architects were Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montagu of British Naval Intelligence and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of MI5, two men who approached their task with a combination of bureaucratic precision and almost theatrical imagination. What they were proposing was not merely a forgery or a planted rumor. They intended to construct an entirely false identity, to manufacture a human being from the paper up, to dress that fiction in a real dead body, and to send it drifting toward the Spanish coast, trusting that the tide, the currents, and the German intelligence network would do the rest. It was an operation that required them to think not as soldiers, but as novelists, and as morticians. The first necessity was a body. This presented difficulties that were as much legal and ethical as they were logistical. The British intelligence services required a corpse that could plausibly have drowned at sea, one whose cause of death would not be immediately obvious to a Spanish pathologist conducting a cursory examination. Through quiet and carefully circumspect channels, they were connected with a man who had recently died in London, a Welsh laborer named Glyndwr Michael, who had consumed rat poison, probably deliberately, in an act of desperation that had left him without family, without prospects, and, in death, without anyone who would notice his disappearance from the world. He was, in the cold arithmetic of wartime intelligence, available. Montagu and Cholmondeley accepted the arrangement, and with it accepted a responsibility to the dead man that they would carry in different ways for the rest of their lives. But a body was only the beginning. What the operation required was a person, a fully realized human being whose existence could survive scrutiny, whose relationships felt real, whose documents were consistent with a life actually lived. The planners named him William Martin, gave him the rank of acting major in the Royal Marines, and set about constructing his world. They wrote him a father, a stern and anxious man who worried about his son's finances. They created a fiancée, a young woman named Pam, and wrote her letters in a voice of tentative, earnest love, letters that were deliberately slightly awkward, slightly unresolved, the kind of letters that felt true precisely because they did not feel composed. They manufactured a snapshot of Pam, cropped from a photograph of a clerk working in MI5. They gave Martin overdue bills from his tailor, a receipt from a London club, theater ticket stubs, a letter from his bank pressing him about an overdraft. Each item was chosen not for drama, but for the texture of ordinary life, for the clutter and friction that marked a real human being moving through a real world. The documents that would carry the strategic deception were of a different order entirely. These were official letters written at the highest levels, purporting to be communications between senior Allied commanders. The most critical was a personal letter from General Sir Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Harold Alexander, then commanding Allied forces in North Africa. The letter, written with studied casualness, referred to planned Allied operations in the Mediterranean, and it named, in the kind of oblique language that suggested a man assuming his reader already knew the broad picture, not Sicily, but Greece and Sardinia as the targets. The letter implied that Sicily was merely a cover plan, a deliberate deception intended to make the Axis believe that Sicily was the real objective, when in fact the Allies intended to strike elsewhere. The irony was recursive, almost dizzying. A letter designed to deceive the enemy about a deception, using the structure of operational frankness to smuggle in a lie.
The documents were crafted with extraordinary care. Genuine staff officers reviewed the language to ensure it matched the register of actual military correspondence. The paper was sourced appropriately. The letters were typed on machines consistent with those available in the relevant offices. Even the briefcase to which the documents were chained to the body itself with a courier's chain, was selected with attention to period-accurate detail. Montagu and Cholmondeley understood that the Germans would not simply accept what they found. German intelligence, and in particular the Abwehr, the military intelligence service that would handle any documents recovered through their Spanish contacts, was not composed of fools. Every detail would be examined. Every inconsistency could unravel the whole. In late April of 1943, the body of William Martin, the body of Glyndor Michael, dressed in the uniform of a Royal Marines officer, his pockets filled with the accumulated evidence of a life, was loaded aboard the British submarine HMS Seraph. The submarine carried him through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the western Mediterranean, moving submerged through waters patrolled by Axis aircraft, navigating toward a point off the southern coast of Spain near the port town of Huelva. Huelva was chosen deliberately. It was known to British intelligence that the German vice-consul there, a man named Adolf Klaus, maintained a close relationship with the local Spanish authorities and was an active conduit for intelligence passed to Berlin. If a body washed ashore near Huelva carrying British military documents, there was every reason to believe those documents would find their way to German eyes. On the morning of April 30, 1943, the crew of HMS Seraph brought the canister containing the body to the surface. The submarine's commander, Lieutenant Bill Jewell, read a brief passage from the 39th Psalm as the canister was opened and the body slipped into the Atlantic. The current, as calculated, would carry it toward shore. Then the Seraph submerged and turned back toward Gibraltar, leaving the dead man to the sea. The body was found that same day by a Spanish fisherman drifting in the shallows near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. Spanish authorities recovered the documents and the briefcase, notified the British vice-consul in Huelva, who immediately signaled London that an officer's body had been recovered and that his papers were in the hands of Spanish officials, and began the process of bureaucratic transfer that the British publicly requested and the Germans privately exploited. The Spanish, officially neutral but broadly sympathetic to the Axis cause in this early period, allowed their German contacts to photograph the documents before returning them. The photographs were developed. The contents were transmitted to Berlin. German intelligence analysts examined the letters and found them, after careful scrutiny, to be genuine. What followed inside the upper reaches of the German High Command was a shift of strategic perception so significant that it would alter the deployment of German military forces across an entire theater of war. The letters, combined with supporting details that German intelligence had independently gathered or believed they had gathered about Allied intentions, produced a coherent and compelling picture. The British were planning to invade Greece and Sardinia. Sicily was the feint. It was a conclusion that confirmed what some German commanders had suspected and that fit the strategic logic they had constructed. Hitler himself reviewed the intelligence and accepted it. Sardinia, he declared, was more threatened than Sicily. He ordered that the island be reinforced. He dispatched armored units and additional divisions to Greece, where he feared the British were preparing to reclaim their foothold in the Balkans. He sent the formidable German Panzer Division, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, along with substantial support toward the eastern Mediterranean. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the Mediterranean theater, attempted to push back. He remained unconvinced that Sicily would be left lightly defended, and he argued for maintaining forces there. But the Führer's orders were the Führer's orders, and the strategic weight of German reinforcement swung away from the island that the Allies actually intended to take. On July 9, 1943, the largest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen to that point began. 160,000 troops, carried in 3,000 ships, began landing on the southern and eastern shores of Sicily under the command of General Montgomery and General Patton. The Axis forces defending the island, Italian divisions of uncertain morale and limited equipment, and German units that had not been reinforced to the degree that might have been possible, were struck with a force and coordination that overwhelmed the coastal defenses within days. The beaches held, the bridgeheads expanded. Within 38 days, Sicily had fallen. The operation, codenamed Husky, succeeded at a pace and with a completeness that surprised even its architects. The absence of the German reinforcements that Hitler had redirected, the divisions that were sitting in Sardinia waiting for an invasion that never came, the armored units positioned in Greece for a landing that existed only on a dead man's papers, was not the sole reason for Allied success in Sicily. The planning was sound, the troops were experienced, the naval and air support was formidable, and the Italian will to fight for a war that had already cost them enormously was fading. But the strategic misdirection engineered by two intelligence officers in a London office, built around the body of a man who had died alone and in despair, removed from the equation precisely the kind of concentrated German resistance that might have transformed a difficult amphibious operation into a catastrophe. The fall of Sicily carried consequences that extended far beyond the island itself. Within days of the Allied landings, the Italian Fascist Grand Council convened and voted to remove Benito Mussolini from power. The man who had ruled Italy as Il Duce for more than 2 decades was arrested on the orders of King Victor Emmanuel III and transported, eventually, to a mountain hotel in the Apennines. Italy began secret negotiations with the Allies. In September, an armistice was announced, and though Germany immediately occupied the northern and central portions of the peninsula, the strategic calculus of the Mediterranean War had been fundamentally redrawn. The soft underbelly, if it was never quite as soft as Churchill imagined, had been penetrated. For the men who had built William Martin, the months that followed the invasion were a period of anxious private verification. Montagu and Cholmondeley could not know with certainty at first that the deception had worked, that the Germans had taken the bait rather than simply photographing the documents for curiosity and discarding them as suspicious. Fragments of intelligence filtered back. Signal intercepts suggested German redeployment. A captured German officer mentioned in passing that Berlin had expected the invasion to come elsewhere. Gradually, the picture assembled itself, and with it came the knowledge that the absurd idea, the memo, the corpse, the forged love letters, the overdue tailor's bills, had done what it was meant to do. Glyndwr Michael was buried in the municipal cemetery in Huelva, in a grave that was maintained by the British government and which read for many years only the name William Martin. It was not until decades later, after the details of Operation Mincemeat were declassified, that his real name was added to the stone. a small acknowledgement that the man who had contributed in death to one of the war's great strategic pivots had once had a life of his own, however brief and difficult it had been. He had died alone, without ceremony, a man whom the world had already largely forgotten before the intelligence services found a use for him. In a strange and sobering sense, the operation gave him a kind of significance he had never possessed in life, folded his existence into a moment of world historical consequence without his knowledge or consent, and then, for years, did not even allow him his own name on his grave. This is what large events require of the individuals caught inside them. They require not only soldiers and commanders and politicians, but also forgers, actors, and the accidentally indispensable dead. The machinery of modern warfare, by 1943, had grown complex enough that its outcomes could be shaped not only by the weight of industry or the courage of troops, but by the quality of a fiction, by whether a letter sounded like something a real general would write, by whether a dead man's pockets contained the right kind of clutter, by whether a corpse released into Atlantic waters at the correct angle would drift in the correct direction. The industrial age had produced armies of unprecedented size and weapons of unprecedented destructive power, but it had also produced intelligence services of unprecedented sophistication, and the interplay between these forces, between the mass and the subtle, the blunt and the intricate, would define how the war was ultimately decided. The Mediterranean campaign did not end with Operation Mincemeat, but it began, in a meaningful way, with a dead man floating toward a Spanish shore carrying someone else's name.
The lesson of decades is not its audacity, but its clarity. It reveals with unusual starkness the degree to which the outcomes of world-altering events can hinge not on the grand sweep of ideology or industrial might, but on the particular texture of a fabricated personal detail, the right kind of overdraft notice, the slightly awkward phrasing of an unsent love letter, the specific weight of a briefcase chain. The architects of the operation understood something that military historians have often underweighted, that the human mind, including the mind of an experienced intelligence analyst, hungers for coherence. It does not simply evaluate evidence in isolation. It assembles evidence into narrative, and once a narrative achieves sufficient internal consistency, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to dislodge, even when that narrative has been engineered by an adversary for precisely that purpose. Hitler's acceptance of the mincemeat documents was not a simple failure of scrutiny. It was a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive that the British would construct so elaborate and so humanly particular a deception. The very thoroughness that made William Martin convincing was the thing that made him inconceivable as a fabrication. There is a broader lesson embedded in that dynamic, one that extends well beyond the corridors of wartime intelligence. Every era of organized human conflict, and every era of organized human competition more broadly, eventually produces actors who understand that the most powerful interventions are not those that overpower an adversary directly, but those that reshape the information environment in which the adversary makes decisions. To control what an enemy believes is to control what an enemy does, and to control what an enemy does without firing a shot is the most efficient form of power that has ever existed. Operation Mincemeat was not the first operation built on that principle, and it was certainly not the last, but it remains among the most perfectly realized, a demonstration conducted in the desperate pressure of global war that a carefully constructed fiction, inhabited fully enough, can move armies, reshape fronts, and alter the course of history with nothing more than a dead man, a briefcase, and the cold, reliable mathematics of an Atlantic tide. The grave in Welva still stands. The name on the stone now reads both William Martin and Glyndwr Michael, the invented man and the real one, sharing a single plot of ground, bound together by a moment that neither of them, in any ordinary sense, chose. It is a quiet place, tended and unassuming, visited occasionally by historians and by those curious enough to make the journey. There is something fitting in its quietness. The most consequential things are not always the loudest. Sometimes the hinge on which history turns is almost invisible. A body in the water, a letter in a briefcase, a tide moving in the right direction at the right hour. The world that emerged from the Second World War was shaped by factories and armies and the terrible arithmetic of industrial slaughter, but it was shaped, too, by moments like this one, where human ingenuity found a way to make the truth itself a weapon, and where a man who had nothing left to give gave everything without ever knowing it.